So I now welcome Mr. Tony Koch. Mr. Koch, I understand that information on parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses and evidence has been provided to you. For the Hansard record, will you please state your full name and the capacities in which you appear today?
Yes, Senator. Good morning, everybody. My full name is Anthony Patrick Koch, K-O-C-H. I'm a retired journalist. I had 35 or so years in the game. I started with Queensland. I was actually a shorthand reporter in the courts, and we trained on Hansard to start with. And then I joined Queensland Country Life for 5 years, and then the Murdoch papers, the Courier Mail, and I rose to associate editor there. I was there for 22 years, and then the last 10 years I had as chief reporter with the Australian newspaper.
Wonderful. Mr. Koch, I invite you to give us a short opening statement and then we'll go to some questions. I understand you're familiar with the terms of reference of the inquiry, so over to you.
Thank you, Senator. Yes, what concerns me most about media these days, and it's different. See, I've been retired 9 years now, and what I noticed and what brought me to write the original letter, which was published in the Guardian, complaining about Murdoch media, was the bias that I perceived and their unwillingness to cover stories that were critical of the Liberal National Party, and they always seemed to me to put a twist on that was anti-Labor, particularly leading up to the elections. That was never the case when I was a journalist with the organisation, and it worried me. What I see as the real problem in more recent times is News Corp's decision to buy all the in the last year or two to buy all the little newspapers and news organisations and radios around the country, and then to close them all down. Now I think it was something like 180. Putting thousands of people out of work, and some of those newspapers, like the Warwick Daily News and all, been going for over 100 years and running profitably. They shut them down. And what this has done is for people to get news in those areas now, well, I'm talking Queensland, you've got Sky News on television, and you haven't got a local newspaper, so you have to go online. If you can do that, if you're tech savvy. Now, the real area that concerns me is this constriction of the news. I was brought up in the bush in a little town in Western Queensland. My dad was a policeman, and I have a real affinity with inland Queensland. And the last 15 years of my journalism career was spent in the Aboriginal communities in Torres Strait and Cape York, that I concentrated on those sort of stories and that coverage. Now, what I see as the big problem is the attack by News Corp on the ABC. The ABC, and I'm not an employee of the ABC. I get nothing from them. In fact, they frustrate me sometimes. But the ABC saves lives in this country, and particularly in rural Queensland. In times of flood, and I've covered many cyclones, bushfires, the people west of the Great Divide in Queensland, their radios are just rusted onto the ABC, and they depend on the ABC, not only for news and politics, and that's where a lot of this argument falls down about media. Media is not just about politics. Media is about properly and truthfully informing the public, the listening public or the reading public about what's going on, the truth of what's going on in this country. As I said before, people depend on the ABC, for life-changing and life-saving decisions. In times of disaster, whether or not to drive a car or fly a plane when the weather's bad. I mean, also the same on Bodie, depending on the ABC, but what cyclones are doing. And I just think it's appalling what News Limited is doing with shutting down everybody they can and just attacking the ABC, so that people will be left with no alternative but to go to the appalling Sky News, which is not a news service at all. It's just rubbish. And then going to, I lost it there somewhere. I lost the. Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can still hear you.
Yeah. I've lost you on the screen. So that's where I'm really at. I just think that in the last 6 or 8 years that the terrible bias against not only the ALP but also against women, Indigenous people. When's the last proper series written with an understanding of Indigenous issues? When did anyone ever last see that in News Corp? It's just rubbish, and it's really sad, and we deserve better. That's probably all I've got to say. I get a bit angry about this. I'm sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Koch. So just to be clear, when did you leave writing for News Corp?
In 2012.
2012. And had you already started to become concerned about the reduction in news value?
No, not at all. I was quite. I was very proud to work for them, and I won Sir Rupert or the Murdoch Award for Australia's top journalist and all that sort of thing, and it was a great organisation, and the paper, The Australian at that time, was a paper that had some authority and had some standing, and people used to read it, and also, it set the scene for news throughout Australia each day, or a lot of days. It wasn't the only one, obviously. And I didn't have any concerns with it at all by the time I had retired.
So what has changed between 2012 and today?
I'd like to know. Obviously, some editors have changed. Obviously, the political landscape has changed, and I just see it. The News Corp papers have taken a huge right turn, and just obviously favour the LNP and kick to death anybody else who's not connected with them, and they ignore great, really serious, important stories about the LNP, about $400 million going to some unheard of barrier reef organisation, bushfire funds being collected and not being distributed. The more recent ones, goodness me, if I was in there. The editors I worked for, I can tell you now, if we were confronted with these rape stories, the most recent ones, there's no way in the world we'd be sitting off and just allowing rubbish opinions like, I haven't read the documents, therefore he's innocent. That just would not have happened. The journalists I work with, the editors I work, and particularly the women journalists I work with, would not have had a bar of that.
Can I ask what the response was to your open letter when you this was quite a. There's not many former News Limited journalists who have been so public with saying that they're going to cancel their subscription to their former employer.
Yeah. You asked me what was the reaction to it. Well, it was certainly a lot of my colleagues and former colleagues wrote in great support of me. There was some criticism. Typically, News Limited got a couple of wannabe grubby journalists to have a go at me, but it didn't go very far because I have a history that I'm proud of, and it's a bit hard to kick around, actually. I'm not skating, but I mean, I've got 5 Walkley Awards, and if anybody wants to take me on and say that I didn't do my job, or I didn't care about the lesser people, I spent my life in Aboriginal communities, and it's just a few of them had to go off me, but not too many. That was just rubbish.
But you did have some others support you in saying that this was their experience.
I had an enormous amount of support, and one big group here took me to lunch here in Brisbane. I had a bit of a misfortune there. I had a stroke not long after that, and got taken to lunch, and it was just and they were just so happy that somebody said it. But see, a lot of them weren't in the favourable position that I'm in that I was retired. I'd collected my superannuation. I'm nicely set up. I'm in a nice marriage and everything. There's nothing in my nobody can hurt me, but that's not the same situation with a lot of my colleagues. Yeah.
Can I ask you, in your writing on this issue, you put specifically that journalists are not to blame.
Yeah.
Can you expand on that? What do you mean by that, and who is to blame then?
Just your day-to-day journalists aren't. I think 90% of them do a great job. I think that the real horrible bias and the horrible misinformation, and I mentioned in that first letter, comes from the commentators, many of whom are not qualified journalists, and also, and some of them are just political hacks. When I say they're not qualified journalists, I'm not just saying that they're the only people who can comment. Obviously, they're not. But for a journalist to write something, and particularly write every week like a lot of those wannabes are doing, we're journalists, we're bound by a code of ethics. We've got to provide balance. We've got to research it properly. We have a responsibility, not only to our employer, but they have a responsibility also to the readership, and that's where I see most of the problem. Obviously, there's a direction. I mean, you've only got to look at the people that have been appointed as commentators and what their background is to see that there's obviously a concerted move by management in News Limited to put in hacks who'll do what they're told, and you get a poor result from it.
One other thing I just wanted to ask before throwing to other senators is, you talked about being proud to work for the national broadsheet, and that it would often lead the news. This was one of the we've had this evidence put forward to us a number of times already, that the influence of the Australian and other News Corp newspapers is far wider than just its concentration in terms of print media. The fact that other news outlets do take their morning news and the day's stories from the front page. Is that what you're referring to? Could you expand on what you mean and what you experienced as a journalist who would get a front page story, the influence that would have on other media?
Yeah, certainly, Senator. Senator, what happens? I mean, obviously, your major daily like the Australian or the Courier Mail or the Sydney Morning Herald, they arrive in newsrooms at daylight. In most commercial radio, for instance, they don't employ obviously a big team of news journalists, and they depend on papers, on news in others from other sources, and they do what we call rip and read. I mean, if there's a little commercial radio, not even little ones, big ones too. They just see a story, what's leading, what most interest is in the paper that comes that morning, and they rip it out and read it. The way it goes, they don't do any investigation or or value add to the story or anything. And certainly, that's what I was referring to. That the major newspapers set the news for the day, and it's the thing that those radio stations, for instance, and morning TV. They're chasing their interviews, and so they grab the Australian or Sydney Morning Herald and they see what's on the front. If there's a politician quoted there, boom, get onto his or her press secretary, and get a voice from the person. Yeah, they do set the tone for the day.
Thank you, Senator Carr.
Yes, thank you very much, Snop, for your appearance today. I noted that. You mentioned some of your credentials. You have 5 Walkley Awards, Honorary Doctorate, Australian School of Journalism, 48 State Journalism Awards, Sir Keith Murdoch News Limited Award, and the Graham Perkins Award. You've been inducted into the Australian Media Hall of Fame. I also noted that Mr Mitchell suggested that your comments actually required, Chris Mitchell suggested that your comments actually were worth thinking about. And given Mr Chris Mitchell's place within News Limited, I thought that was particularly significant. So having said that, I just had a look over your piece, and what I'd be interested to know, given your extensive experience, is how the process of news creation actually works in the within news. You discuss the changes that you observed, and you say the consequences that newspapers, in my opinion, avoid their primary responsibility to be fearless watchdogs of government and society, and work to ensure that wrongs are exposed and fairness is invoked for all. And then you go on to say, it grieves me to say that Australia has become little more than a laughingstock. But you then say this as well. You say, I must say I've never in my years been instructed to write an article or not write an article because it suited a political bent of a particular editor. So how is it that this bias, as you describe, does develop within the news organisation such as the Australian?
Yes, Senator, thanks for asking that, because I was really keen to make it very clear that in all my years in the paper, in the various newspapers, I was never once instructed to write a certain political way. And I'm sure that I never had an article not published because of it expressed a certain opinion. So things changed after I left, and it's obvious just the amount of biased rubbish that's published now that is being done at direction. I'd just like to mention about Chris Mitchell that you mentioned there before. He's an editor who he retired about the same time as me, I think a bit after me, and he still writes a weekly column on the media and gets stuck into the ABC, and I disagree with a lot of that. But Chris Mitchell, he gets a lot of criticism, but I can never criticise the bloke because he's the one who gave me open slather and picked up huge bills for me going to, from Brisbane to Cape York and the Gulf Carpentaria and Torres Strait, year upon year upon year, and very expensive trips to try and assist with the Indigenous issues. And we had a real tie-in with marvellous Indigenous man, Noel Pearson, as you'll know. To get back to the point, I'll also mention this too. Mitchell was the one. I refused to do anything positive with Pauline Hanson. I just absolutely disagreed with what she was on. And I was senior enough that I was able to discuss these issues with an editor. I didn't always get my way with them, but I refused to have anything to do with that. And it was me who convinced Mitchell to adopt a a proper attitude and questioning of Hansen. In fact, we took it to lunch one day. And also, I might just say that I used to do bits on provide bits on radio at the time, and I refused ever to have anything to do with Hansen. But I'm probably getting off the point of your question. So, I'm sorry. Would you mind just asking me?
So can I just come
back to the subject?
How is it that bias is developed within the newspaper? I mean, I read the Australian every day.
Yeah.
When I look at, there'll sometimes be 9 or 10 anti-Labor stories in the first couple of pages of the newspaper. I see it as opinion dressed up as news. How does that develop in such a way as you get a campaign approach to the coverage of public affairs?
The only way, I mean, nothing can go in the paper without the imprimatur of of whoever is the editor at the time. And so the short answer to your question is because that's what the editor wants. And it's also the editor. You have a news conference in the afternoon, and all the stories that journalists have gathered during the day, they put in a brief summary, 3 or 4 line summary on what's called a news list. There's 8 or 10 people sitting around a table deciding where the stories are going to go. And the editor is always the chair of that meeting, and he or she decide, the placement of the stories. I'd like to make something very clear about bias. Now, some years ago at a state election in Queensland, I was with the Courier Mail, and one of our universities did an exercise on bias. They had their students go through the Courier Mail and the then Australian newspaper. The Daily Sun was operating here in Brisbane. And they came up with some conclusions by revealing how many column centimetres, each party got and each candidate and all this. Now, where that falls down and where people, bias can be very sneaky. The Australian newspaper and them don't even bother to be sneaky now, but you can say that the Prime Minister and the opposition leader got equal column centimetres, but if one of them is on the front page smiling and helping an old person across the street, and the other one is snarling and doing something horrible with an angry crowd, holding up signs of ditch the bitch, and it's on page 2. If you want to have, the saying in newspapers is you've got to be on a right-hand page and above the fold. If you're not, if you're below the fold, if you're on a left-hand page, you're being treated poorly, and that's more the bias.
So in terms of the journalistic approaches, it's a question of placement. It's a question of the headline. It's a question of the photograph. It's the presentational issues. But you also mentioned that you had a view in regard to Aboriginal affairs. It'd be fair to say, I think it'd be fair to say that the Australian has taken a particular, I would suggest a positive view in regard to many Indigenous affairs issues as distinct from other tabloid publications. Is it also a question of getting journalists to do certain stories that is understood to have a particular approach to a matter?
Oh yeah. And that's reasonable. I think if you talk about Indigenous affairs, I think it's you've got to tell the whole story, and for instance, go to a community and tell it warts and all, but you don't forget the good things that are happening and the people who are trying and that sort of thing. And
but you could take a story, for instance, on other fields. I noticed, for instance, the switch that's been taken on certain security questions at the moment. There used to be a very favourable attitude towards the People's Republic of China. It's a very negative attitude. are journalists not instructed, but are they picked because they have a particular approach to an issue?
No, I wouldn't have thought so. I think that the journalist who's there, who might be covering around, your really senior journalists who are, writing the upfront stories, the editor will often call them in or come and sit at their desk and have a talk to them and say, what have you found out today? Who are you talking to? That sort of thing. No, I don't think, it's not my experience that people are handpicked because they might lean that way. No.
So, and is that because you think as a senior journalist you'd be treated differently from a junior journalist?
Oh, absolutely. And that's 100%.
So, because I'm trying to come to grips with how the news is constructed, as distinct from, given your statement that you were never told what to write.
Yeah.
But you told the editor that you weren't going to write certain things. So clearly there is a political judgment within the newsroom as to how the newsroom will deal with a political or a public issue, put it that way, a public issue. Now, not all journalists would have your seniority, your ethics perhaps. Some journalists will approach a public issue in a different way, and would you agree?
Yes, I do agree. You're dealing with human beings, and most journalists, and I'm very pro-journalist, obviously. Most journalists are educated and reasonably or highly intelligent people, and if you get a chief of staff, and they're the ones who assign stories in a newsroom, if you get one who says, this, I want you to go out and do this, and I think this is the angle. Well, most journalists, even more junior ones, would say, but, isn't this so or isn't that so? And there's a bit of a discussion goes on.
But you say those standards can't apply to columnists.
No.
Many of my friends, decades, they share my disgust. You actually use the word disgust for columnists.
Yeah.
Predictable, weak, unresearched and juvenile.
Yeah.
Why don't they have the same standards?
No, not at all. Columnists are not bound, as I mentioned before, by ethics. And they're for instance, and it's reasonable to write a comment. You don't have to. You're not bound to go and get both sides of a story. I mean, I think that's appalling, but that's the way. That's the comment as comment. When Mitchell first came to the Australian newspaper and he got me to write a Saturday column, he said, "I want you to break stories every other week in your column." So what he expected from me was that they had to be better researched and to be able to stand scrutiny, not just flippant stuff that happens to be anti whatever, for instance, the Labor Party came up with that week.
Yeah. So we take, for instance, in your piece in The Guardian, you referred to, this is a contemporary piece, you said the appalling story concerning Bill Shorten's mother's work.
Oh, yeah.
Now, why were you so concerned about that particular matter?
Well, that was that current example. I saw Shorten talk about his mum there and how she hadn't been able to. She'd always wanted to be a lawyer, but she ended up having to be a teacher, which was a fine story. And then the next one, a couple of days later, I forget which publication, it was certainly a Murdoch one, came up with a story saying that not the full story was told because 30 or 40 years later the lady actually did a law degree. I mean, that's just grubby, and it was to attack the family, and I just thought it was low rent stuff and unworthy of any publication.
So this issue about the treatment of private lives of public figures is not confined to politicians, of course. I mean, do you think that's in response Has that changed in your experience as a professional in the media? Is that a response, for instance, to social media, if it is a more contemporary question?
Oh, absolutely. The privacy issue is one that's of enormous concern, I think, and social media, certainly has to be looked at in that regard. I've seen some stuff in social media that's just appalling, and certainly if it was published in any paper I work for, the size of the writ that would have to be paid to be enormous. I think there's a very cavalier approach taken now to people's privacy, and it's not helped. And I'm not saying this is a political statement. I'm saying it as a political fact. It's not helped by this current federal government, who have a very weird attitude to protecting like whistleblowers and that sort of thing. And it's seemed more concentrating on sending little girls over to Christmas Island and putting them in a cage for 3 years.
I just want to finally turn to this issue of rip and read. You've drawn attention to what happens in regional radio and the like, and as a politician of some considerable years myself, I've observed this, especially in under-resourced radio stations. But I've also observed that at major outlets like the ABC, if you listen to some of the current affairs programs early in the morning, you get the distinct impression that they have taken stuff directly from the front pages of the Australian. So is it not also a problem with people who have taken as face value material that is presented as news when it is in fact opinion, presented on the front page of the National Daily because it is available quickly and it's presented the night before in all our inboxes? Is that not as much a problem where people are actually not doing the research that's required? They're under-resourced as well. But the question of the ethics of journalistic presentation applies not just to under-resourced regional radio stations?
Absolutely. What you're saying is correct. All the major TVs, for instance, and radio, do grab it in the morning and go with it. I've heard it. I would have heard it this morning if I'd turned on. See, the fact is that newspapers are yesterday's news tomorrow, and the best and most succinct news service is radio because it's immediate. I have spent so much time at emergency situations like cyclones and floods and all that, and I just envy the radio journalist who can stand there and do an interview and boom, the whole of Australia or the world knows what's going on, whereas I have to humbly sneak back to my motel room and type a story in my day anyway that comes out tomorrow. Of course it goes online now, but Senator, what you're saying is right. It's not only the regionals who do it, and there's been a problem with under-resourcing newsrooms for, since I started journalism,
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Koch, we're going to go to Senator Fawcett, who's on the phone. Senator Fawcett, are you there?
I am, thank you, Chair. Mr. Koch, thank you for appearing today. I'd like to take you to the terms of reference for the inquiry, which focus very heavily in the key terms of reference about the impact of media diversity on our democracy. You've talked about your concern about what you perceive as bias within the News Corp papers towards the LNP. In Queensland, where there has been concerns or have been concerns raised by the submitters about the percentage of ownership by News Corp of papers, which they deny in their evidence, I'd point to the fact that the ALP has won 8 out of the last 9 elections. So I'm just wondering how that fact, that electoral outcome, correlates with your concern that the bias is A, present, and B, distorting our democracy.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Senator, the fact that, if you looked at News Corp's Courier Mail and the Australian Effort, the last state election here, they were just daily belting the ALP and the current Palaszczuk government and they editorialised, the wise thing to do is to vote for him. And then there was a landslide victory to Labor and to Palaszczuk. Now, that said a couple of things to me. One, the editor of those publications was totally out of touch with the public mood and the public opinion. I mean, it was just an absolute disaster for the polls and everything. So what I'd like to say, I'd like to expand a little bit. I think that we talk about the democratic process. I think it goes further than that. I think that if we suffer the degrading of the ABC in particular in Australia, I think there's a national security issue that we've got here. You've got people's lives and people's livelihoods at stake because they're not able to get a true and honest service that they deserve. And I think I'll just expand a little one. I hope I'm not taking too much of your time. The closure by all these papers and other news organisations by News Corp, which was absolute act of political bastardry. What it's done is to deny people in all those little towns, Bowra, Roma, Charlotte, whatever, all the local news service. But it's also, and this is why I can't understand the National Party, not representing rural people, it's also denied local politicians in all those areas, the daily, weekly feed of, I opened a toilet block at the local state school and a photo in and all that sort of thing. And in fact, I had a big laugh after the last Queensland election when Pauline Hanson was interviewed and said, why did you do so poorly in Queensland? She said, it was just terrible. We would fly into a little town and I'd get up and speak the rubbish I speak, but there was no one there to listen to me. There was no radio microphone in my face, no TV, no newspaper reported because they just don't exist. They're not there. So we got no coverage, and that's why I went so badly. And anyway, I thought fair enough.
Senator Fawcett.
So I guess, Mr. Koch, the question though is if News Corp are so biased and their coverage is so dominant, the ALP won 8 out of the 9 elections, which says that there is another presence. And certainly I've raised this in previous hearings, that online polling, and certainly that conducted by the ABC, shows that they believe that they are Australia's most trusted news source. And yet their own internal review after the 2019 election found that they needed to increase the diversity of views on political programs. And they in fact found that in the month leading up to the election, shows like Insiders and The Drum were clearly favouring Labor and ideas and policies associated with the left of politics. That's a quote from that internal review. So do you accept that other organisations such as the ABC also, in their own internal reviews, evidence bias, and that in terms of the outcome of Australia's democracy, that is actually more influential than the News Corp papers?
No, I don't think that at all. I bow to your wisdom in relation to those surveys. I don't follow them, and I don't watch a lot of those current affairs things, because news service, Senator, with the greatest respect, is not just about politics, and an electorate doesn't just look at the political aspects of what's going on. I mean, I think that the two biggest issues, facing the election now are employment and security of employment, and who's addressing that, and whether or not the ABC has a bias. I mean, if your survey show that, well and good, and it should be addressed.
Mr. Koch, that's actually the ABC's own internal review said that.
Yeah, fair enough. If that's what's being found, well, that's got to be addressed. Yeah, I have no opinion on that. It's not my it's not my experience, but I look at a broader ABC than just any particular, 1 hour show once a week or whatever. I just think that's a bit silly.
Okay, no further questions. Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Mr. Koch.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Koch. Thank you for your time today. We appreciate it. If there's anything that you think you need to clarify at any point, get in touch with the Secretariat. But we thank you for making time today, and thank you for squeezing in the time frame, considering you're an hour behind us there in Queensland. So
yeah,
thank you.
Thank you, Senator, and all the best to all of you with your deliberations. Thank you.
Thank you.